So today we're taking up gate 103 of the 108 gates of Dharma-Illumination, and you'll recall that this text shows up in the 12 fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. He did not write this list. It actually comes from an older, longer text called the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha, but clearly he thought there was something important in this. And he wrote some words at the end to say we should pay some attention to the things on this list. So I've been talking about this darn text since 2016, and we're on the home stretch. 103 of 108. So today's gate statement says, accomplishment of the state of dharani is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we hear the Dharma of all the Buddhas and are able to receive and retain it. So maybe like me, when you first hear that statement, you think, well, that sounds kind of familiar. It sounds like this thing we just chanted to open the sutra, right? There's some connections there. So we'll talk about that. But first, let's look at the elements, as always, that are specific to this gate statement. So accomplishment of the state of dharani might seem like an unusual phrase. Not so long ago here, we heard from Doju about dharani, right? He gave a talk about dharani, what those are. So a dharani, again, is an incantation or a spell. Most familiar to us probably is the Daihishin dharani for people who do the morning service here or just are floating around in this Soto Zen world. Daihishin dharani is pretty familiar. There are many, many more dharani. Shosai Myo Kichijo Dharani is the thing we do in front of the kitchen altar every morning if you're in a training temple or you're in a larger residential place. Following the morning service, a few of us gapple on down to the kitchen and do the Shosai Myo in front of the altar. It's a sort of a disaster preventing dharani, right? Anybody know that one? Whoa, one person knows it. If you do it, it goes very quickly, right? Right? Goes very quickly. So there's something, I think there's some energy around that. And if you're doing it like 3 times, it gets faster and faster and faster. And it feels like you're building up something and then throwing that into the world. So the other one people may know about is the Kanromon, or the Ambrosia Gate, which is a text that we do for evening service in a larger place, or a hungry ghost ceremony. We just did one for the anniversary. We did a lot of anniversary events last May and November around Keizan's memorial and Jukai 100 and some other things. So this is a text which is really just a long string of dharanis, one after the other. So it's not a text like a sutra. It's just like one dharani after another. So lots of bells and lots of shifting of cadence. I love it. I love the Kanromon. I think it's really fun. It's kind of scary as a doan, but I think it's a lot of fun. So it's one dharani after another. It switches back and forth into sort of transliterated Sanskrit, and it's kind of an interesting text. So you may encounter that if you haven't already. So the upshot of this is these things are not normal language. This is transliterated Sanskrit, and it's transliterated, through Chinese into Japanese. Occasionally it gets translated into English. I hope not, because it loses something, really. The meaning of these things is not in the content of the words, it's in the sound, because Sanskrit is sort of considered to be a magical language. So the power of these things, the power of the incantation is in the sound. So this is how we usually think of dharani, something like Daihishin, Shosai Myo Kichijo Dharani, Kanromon, something where we're throwing a protection spell over something, right? Now, you can believe in that or not. But in the genre of, sort of Buddhist literature, that's how we think of those things. But this gate statement says, accomplishing a state of dharani. So like, what is going on? So there's a chapter in a collection of Mahayana sutras called the Mahasamnipata, and it uses the term dharani pratilabdha. And what that means is somebody who has attained memory or attained dharani. So this is dharani as memory, rather than simply dharani as a spell or a chant or an incantation. Dharani is memory, and you just think, well, that's an interesting intersection. That's not how we think about dharani. I think particularly because for us, we're doing dharani in some language which is not our normal language. So like, how can that be about remembering something? So the text says that a bodhisattva attains memory after doing 32 kinds of purifications And then the rain of the Dharma falls, and it puts out the fires of delusion and samsara and makes all the qualities of the Buddha grow. Well, Dharma rain is an image we're used to, right? That's something we run across. This is nirvana, right? We're extinguishing this flame of suffering and desire and clinging and madness, right? So the text says, he who has attained memory or attained dharani knows the practice that is never forgetting any dharma of the Buddha. In this way, son of good family, the bodhisattva who has attained memory practices not forgetting. So a dharani as a verse might serve as a mnemonic, a way to remember the essence of various teachings of the Buddhas and ancestors, as well as an incantation for protection. So by extension, attaining dharani, or attaining a state of dharani, is being able to retain and uphold all of Buddha's teachings, so nothing gets lost, right? So for our friends in the Pure Land tradition, attaining dharani is the 46th vow of Amida Buddha in the Infinite Life Sutra. So you'll recall there were 48 great vows. So the 46th one, when I attain Buddhahood, all the bodhisattvas in other worlds, upon hearing my name, will realize the dharma of away from birth and attain dharani. So in this sutra, Hozo Bosatsu makes 48 great vows, promising to create a pure land, guaranteeing rebirth in this pure land for anybody who would sincerely recite his name, particularly at the time of death. So when we're talking about death practices, sometimes we'll run across these references. You need to be chanting Amida's name at the time of death. You'll go to the Pure Land. So when this bodhisattva fulfills all these vows, he attains Buddhahood. He becomes Amida Buddha. So this 46th vow says, by hearing his name, bodhisattvas will realize the dharma of away from birth and attain dharani. So in the world of form, there's arising and perishing and birth and death, and in the world of emptiness, there is no arising and perishing and birth and death. So in attaining dharani, the bodhisattva can carry both of these truths, because both of these things are true, right? So in attaining dharani, bodhisattva carries both of these truths. So conditioned things are impermanent. Nobody would deny that. The nature of things is things arise and decay and change, right? And also, when everything is one piece, when everything is without any fixed self-nature, then there's no coming and going and no birth and death, right? So both of these things are true when we get to carry both of them. So some translations of this vow don't use the phrase attaining dharani. They say bodhisattvas will spontaneously be able to hear and learn any dharma teaching they wish, which is almost, I think, a direct parallel with our Gates statement. We hear the dharma of all the Buddhas and are able to receive and retain it. So spontaneously, anything you want to know, anything you want to learn about the Buddha Dharma, you can do, and you will understand it, and you will remember it and retain it, be able to live with that. So also, the introduction to the Lotus Sutra describes the Buddha at a gathering of many, many beings. 12,000 monks, 2,000 students, 6,000 followers of nuns, 60,000 sons of gods, 8 dragon kings, and various other special beings. So this is a big group, right? This is a big party up on the mountain. And also, there are 80,000 bodhisattvas who had all attained dharani and joyful, unobstructed eloquence and turned the irreversible Dharma wheel. So I think in looking at these groups of beings, it's really interesting that amongst all of these incredibly special people and deities and whatever, dragons, the bodhisattvas had attained dharani and were put in their own category. So we've got 80,000 bodhisattvas that have attained dharani. Didn't say all of these other 12,000, 60,000, whatever. 80,000 bodhisattvas had attained dharani. So I think the implication there kind of is it's not enough to be a dragon king. It's not enough to be, a great deity. You have to be a bodhisattva and attain dharani. So it's the bodhisattvas that are in a position to do that and to be able to hear and learn and practice and retain whatever dharma they wish. So that's something interesting for us, right, as human bodhisattvas in this world. We don't have to be special. We just have to do the practice. So attaining dharani, or being within awakening, we can remember and practice all of Buddha's teachings. So all of Buddha's and ancestors and everybody's teachings. So that's not a matter of memorizing a long list of things. This is not memorizing the index of a book and then going down the list and practicing each thing like a checklist, right? That's too linear for us. It's a matter of seeing the entirety of the reality of this moment And on that basis, understanding all of these teachings, seeing all of these teachings and how they fit together and how they describe this one moment of true reality. So by going through one door, we could say, by going through one door, we go through all doors. By simply seeing and understanding the entirety of this moment. It's like all those teachings are there, and we can see them and understand them. So we can see broadly then how to apply the Dharma in each situation. How are we liberating beings, including this one, in each situation? So not only that, we can then expound those teachings, we can share that Dharma clearly with others. So that's turning the Dharma wheel, right? That's why the irreversible nature of turning that Dharma wheel is important, right? We are manifesting, sharing, transmitting Dharma in the world. So attaining dharani is sometimes coupled with something called non-retreating wisdom. So we can't backslide. Once we have wisdom, somehow we don't backslide. We don't forget what Buddha taught, right? We don't forget what our practice is. And we have the energy and the conviction to then share that Dharma in the world so it doesn't get lost. So we're not forgetting. It's not getting lost in the world. Other people are not forgetting. So sometimes here we talk about the age of Mappo, right? The age of degenerate Dharma. This is kind of the opposite. We're keeping Buddha alive in the world. We're keeping Dharma alive in the world. And Sangha is alive because here we are. So the sutra says we do that with joyful eloquence, or unobstructed eloquence of joyful speech. And of course, we know this is one of the four kinds. So this is one of the four kinds of unobstructed eloquence. This one in particular is about being able to talk about the Dharma in ways people can understand and in ways that make them happy. So I think we have to be careful about making people happy. This is not about saying only the things that people want to, that make their egos feel good. But how do we skillfully say something toward the liberation of beings which allows them to let go of suffering? I think that's what this is pointing to. It's not pointing to ego happy, right? It's pointing to peace and contentment and equanimity, right? And release of suffering. So attaining a state of dharani means we have the wisdom to understand and remember Buddha's teachings, and then the compassion to share them skillfully with others. Wisdom and compassion, right? We need both sides. So this is retaining, this is upholding, as these verses and Gates statements are talking about. So we can see why it makes sense that we use dharani as a label for some of our verses. It literally means that by which something is sustained. Now we're talking about sustainability. That's really interesting. So, however, as a mnemonic for remembering teachings, I think dharanis don't make so much sense because they were transliterated, as I say, from Sanskrit to Chinese to Japanese, and sometimes they end up in some kind of English form. But all of those transliterations were happening because of the sound. So if you look at the way these are written down, the content doesn't always make sense. If you try to translate them, it's gibberish. People have tried, it's gibberish. They're being translated for sound. So if you look at the kanji, for instance, that kanji is for sound, not necessarily for meaning. So that sound itself was supposed to contain some magical properties. So as soon as you translate it, you break it, right? It doesn't work anymore as a magical incantation. So we usually don't know what text these things are summarizing anyway. If these dharani are supposed to be, sort of cliff notes for a sutra, we don't know anymore, like what text these things, often we don't know what text were these things sort of attached to. So as a mnemonic for remembering a sutra, or remembering a teaching, maybe not, right? And somehow we've got these two sort of aspects of dharani. Now, of course, there is the teaching that everything is the Buddha's Dharmakaya. Everything is the Buddha's body. All sentient and insentient beings are preaching the Dharma all the time. So in that way, it doesn't really matter whether we understand in this way what exactly we're chanting. It's the act of chanting, right, that's important. So we don't necessarily have to believe in these things as having the power to avert disaster. The act of completely carrying out our function in that moment of chanting this dharani wholeheartedly, as Jiju Yudzamai, is the retaining and upholding of this Dharmakaya. Dharma is here. Buddha's body is here, simply because we are wholeheartedly engaged in this practice. So I think that doesn't negate the importance of chanting that thing correctly. If you screw up a dharani, the magic doesn't work, right? So you got to do it. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Vedas, right? You got to do it like properly. You can't just sort of do it any old which way, and yet, right? The act of wholeheartedly chanting that thing, in a way, it doesn't matter what you're chanting. So we get to hold these two things. So attaining a state of dharani is not going into a trance while we're chanting something repetitive. This is not a practice of self-hypnosis, which when we see something like state of dharani and we try to put chanting with a state of mind, we just think, what's happening, right? So this is not about hypnotizing ourselves or entering into a trance where we go somewhere else. The point of this is not that. So, accomplishment of the state of dharani is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we hear the Dharma of all the Buddhas and are able to receive and retain it. So in other words, entering into awakening, we completely see the true reality of all beings, and we understand all of Buddha's teachings about that. So we practice our understanding ourselves, and we share that understanding with others in some way that they can grasp, in some way that they can take it in and begin to loosen the bonds of suffering, right? Begin to move toward liberation. So we can help them become liberated from suffering to find some peace and contentment. So let's put the gate statement next to this opening of the sutra verse that we just chanted. The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Now we can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's words. So this seems to have many of the same elements, right, as this gate statement. There's seeing and hearing and accepting and maintaining, or receiving and retaining. There's unfolding the Dharma, sharing the Dharma with others. So I've got to think there's some connection here. So this verse that we do is not a dharani. We're not doing it in Sino-Sanskrit. It's a gatha. So a gatha is a different literary form. Gatha is a poem for singing or chanting. It is not something, it's not poems that get written down so that we can read them. This is very much about vocalizing, putting something into the world. This form is actually a bit of Zoroastrian influence that we picked up along the Silk Road. If you look into Zoroastrianism, there's a lot of gathas, and they're really important in that tradition. So for us, in the world of Soto Zen, there is a gatha for just about everything we do in a day in the temple. And sometimes, even if you're living at home, it can be really interesting to adopt the practice of out loud or in your mind doing these four-line gathas when we do these everyday things. It can remind us to practice, right? So talk about a mnemonic. I know people who have gone and written down all the gathas on little Post-its, and then they post them where the thing happens that they do, brushing their teeth, right? Or whatever it is, just to remind every day, remind us to practice, which is a kind of an interesting thing to do. So there's a gatha for waking up, for washing your face, for brushing your teeth, for using the toilet, for, right, for like all these things, taking a bath. So they help us remember, I think, every action, including the mundane, day-to-day, just everyday stuff that we do in our daily life is practice. That's the Dharma. That's the Buddha right there, if we choose to take it on in that way. So that's all well and good, but why is it important to recognize opening a sutra like we do here every Sunday? So opening, if we think about opening, it can mean two things. One is it's a literal sort of unrolling, unfolding, opening a book, opening a scroll. There's something going on there on which the sutra is written. So sutras are relics of Buddha, right? So we have to take care of sutras in a particular way. We handle those things with care. We don't put them on the floor. We don't stack things on top of them, right? We treat that sutra, even if it's a cheap photocopy of a sutra, we have to treat that sutra like a relic of Buddha, which I think is a really interesting practice. So it's important to pay attention if we're going to open something and study it together or by ourselves. It's important to pay attention about what's our attitude toward that. It isn't just, oh, grab a book and throw it open on the table. It's like, okay, this is a relic of Buddha. I'm going to have some intention and attention to how I handle this and think about it and interact with it. So that's one kind of opening. The other kind of opening is that we're revealing or introducing or making available that sutra by reading it out loud, by talking about it, by explaining it. We know this is an important part of our practice. It's one thing to read and take in, and it's another thing to give it sound and put it out in the world. So this is how the Dharma is heard and received. And of course, back in the day, these things weren't written down. This was completely an oral tradition. So you can imagine how important this was. The way stuff got transmitted was somebody, Buddha or somebody explained it. It got remembered. It got chanted. That's how it got transmitted. So we encounter words like unfolding the Tathagata's words, unfolding the Tathagata's teachings, because that was traditionally, that's really an important part of our practice. So in this day and age, I think often we're practicing alone, we're practicing at home, we're listening to talks virtually somewhere, and we can feel very sort of isolated about that, and we're very quiet in our practice. So it might be, even if we're practicing at home alone, a little chanting is a good thing. So, opening of the sutra verse in Japanese, Kaikyo-ge. So this is not a verse which is specific to Zen. This shows up in Tendai and in other kind of Japanese traditions. So, unlike what we do, it's 4 lines of 7 kanji which are quite regular. Mujo jinjin mi myoho hyakusan mango nansogu gakkon kenmon tokujuji gangen yorai shinjutsugi. Right? It's got a rhythm, unlike what we do. The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma, right? The cadence is different. That's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just interesting to know. So this verse is at least as old as the 500s AD. This is not a new thing. It shows up in liturgical texts from that time in China, so we've kind of inherited it. It has some connection to the Lotus Sutra, so this is not a modern Western thing. So the unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma. So Todo-san has pointed out elsewhere that this phrase is pointing in 2 directions. The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma. So unsurpassed means highest and broadest, right? This is movement upward, movement outward. Profound and wondrous means subtle and deep. So this is movement downward or movement inward. So this is pointing 2 directions at the same time. This Dharma is both expansive and absolute and detailed and concrete. So it's not just something we're thinking about. This is very much about what am I doing right now in this moment. And also, we can't get so stuck in what am I doing now in this moment that we fail to see interconnectedness and impermanence and all the sort of larger attributes of this. So this is both the Dharma that means the way the universe functions, the highest and broadest, in reality, and the Dharma that means what did the Buddha awaken to and what is he teaching? So when we hear the Dharma of all the Buddhas, in the Gates statement, we hear the whole entire story. Gates statement says we hear the Dharma of all the Buddhas. So we're hearing both directions. We're hearing highest and broadest, and we're also hearing detailed and concrete. So all sentient and insentient beings preaching the Dharma or completely manifesting the truth of this moment, right? Both in the largest possible sense of being within this network of interdependent origination that doesn't have any boundaries or outside edge. That's the prajna element. That's the wisdom element. And in the sense that we're encountering living beings, and living beings are suffering because that's just the nature of being, right? Living beings are suffering and they need our help, and that's the compassion piece. So it's both wisdom and compassion, right? We understand the broad sort of way things function, and then, using our prajna, using our wisdom, and then our compassion says, and in this moment, there's something concrete, there's a person in front of me, there's a world on fire, what am I going to do? So something unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous is not something we can understand intellectually. It's not something we can measure or compare based on sort of our limited human thoughts and fabrications and concepts. So we have to give up our preconceptions about what we're about to receive. And isn't that an interesting way to approach our Dharma study? I have to give up my preconceptions about what I'm going to hear, what I'm going to read. Even though, most of the time, well, we're about to hear a Dharma talk. We've got some idea probably what's going on here. You know the topic before you got here today. So accomplishment of the state of dharani, or remembering what Buddha taught, is the same as seeing both dimensions of this Dharma, the highest and the deepest, the wisdom and the compassionate, the Dharma of all the Buddhas, right? This is the most complete view. So the verse goes on, is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. So I've always thought this was an interesting line. On the one hand, the chance to study the Dharma is pretty uncommon. You know, to encounter people who are carrying out this practice, which has been authentically transmitted down this lineage, 2,500 years, or a teacher who really understands the Dharma, really embodies something, can explain it in ways that encourage us to practice, that inspire us to practice. All of that's pretty rare anyway, and then let alone in 21st century North America, where this is not a mainstream practice. Given that, yes, we can go on the internet today and encounter like anything, right? But to encounter this in person, which is, you know, where the juice is, it's like that is a rare gift. That doesn't come along every day. And yet, the previous lines just said the Dharma is everywhere, from the highest and broadest to the subtlest and the deepest. So this kind of points me back to Dogen's original question. If awakening is already here, then what are we doing? Why do we have to practice? If all these things are already here, why do we have to practice? Well, how often do we actually meet with the Dharma? Right? The Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. So we're swimming in Dharma. We're immersed in Dharma all the time, every moment of the day, because we can't not be immersed in it. Like, how is it not here? How are we separate from that? But we can really go our whole lives and not see it, right? Something flipped a switch for each and every one of us, and we said, I'm going to the Zendo. Something flipped a switch to say, there's something more happening here, and I want to investigate this thing called Buddhism, or what Buddha taught, or the Dharma, or something, right? It's like we weren't born being able to see it, and then something happens in our lives. Maybe we encounter that really amazing teacher. Maybe that teacher is grandma. It doesn't have to be, you know, a Buddhist monk. Maybe there's some suffering in our lives. Or maybe there's a wonderful thing that happens, and we sit up and look around like prairie dogs and go, oh, there's something else here that I want to investigate, right? So somehow we connect ourselves with it, right? We don't always see it. We don't always connect ourselves with it. We need to practice and do zazen, work and study, and then something starts to, I hope, something starts to coalesce for us. We get to see it. Then we meet the Dharma. It's like, oh, something's here. Oh, you know, I never realized. I was so caught up in my mental fabrications. I didn't know there was anything more than this. Not outside of this, more than this. We become a little less self-involved, you know, than the bodhisattva, the bodhicitta, all that starts to arise. So now we can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. So the verse says accept and maintain it. Gates' statement says we're able to receive and retain it. So seeing and hearing some teachings about the Dharma, we're now ready to take those in. So that too requires some intention. It's not just a matter of sort of downloading stuff and filing it away, right? Sort of along with all of our other life information. We have to be ready to engage with this material, this Dharma, this teachings. So there are so many places in our practice, I think, where we encounter this pattern of needing to be intentional and being ready to hear something, being ready to receive Dharma. One of the reasons that precepts are important for us, as one of the threefold learnings of the Eightfold Path, is that they help us settle down. If I'm not out there perpetrating suffering for myself and others, I can calm down enough, maybe, to let go of some distraction, to fully engage in practice, right? So precepts are important for a lot of reasons. One of them is, very directly for us, it helps us let go of our stuff and settle down. If I'm not perpetuating suffering, good. I can see a little more clearly, right? I can act a little more wisely. Zazen, of course, is important in a similar way. We're not sitting zazen in order to, and yet, we sit. We drop off body and mind. We settle, right? So we also see this pattern of preparing to receive teachings in some of the ceremonies that we do. So giving precepts is that way, receiving precepts, both for lay people and ordained people. Ryaku-fusatsu, we do that, which may be the thing you're more familiar with because we do it here every 30 days, right? So the order of service in any Soto Zen context, the order of service is not at all random. We can't just string together a bunch of sutras or teachings or poems or something that we like and say, there, that's liturgy. There's a story. There's a very deliberate arc of that story. So for Ryaku-fusatsu, for instance, we start with repentance. There's a reason we start with repentance. all this karma, all this twisted karma I've created, I acknowledge that I've created it. Now I can let go of it. Then we go on to bodhisattva vows. I've now done my repentance. Now I'm vowing again to live like a bodhisattva, to follow the precepts, to do my practice, to be a bodhisattva in the world. Whew! Kind of let go of that. Now I'm going to start again with a clean slate and vow to do something. And we know this vow and repentance is not only at Ryakusatsu. This is moment by moment by moment by moment. Our practice is never complete. We're constantly vowing and repenting. But this is a way that we do it kind of as a group. So we've cleaned the slate. We've renewed our aspiration. The next thing we do is invoke Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as witnesses. So they're all there in the room with us. What are we doing? Remembering what Buddha taught, right? We're doing some dharani here, right? We're remembering Buddhas and ancestors and what did they teach us, and we're getting ourselves back in line. Then we do a ritual purification of the space with the wisdom water, and now finally we're ready to hear the Kyojukaimon. We've done all these things. Purification in a number of ways if you want to look at it like that. Now we're ready to hear the Kyojukaimon. Now we're ready to hear the precepts and what the teachings are about the precepts, right? So now we can see and hear it. Now we can receive and accept teachings without hindrances, without distractions, right? This purification is not about making us holy people. That's not it. It's about letting us drop stuff. It's about letting us drop karma and body and mind and all the distractions, and then being ready to really deeply receive and enter into and hear and engage with what Buddha taught and what ancestors and teachers have taught. So there's also this element in both the verse and the statement about maintaining or retaining. I think that's important. In both cases, the root of that word is to hold on to something. So retain means to hold something back. Maintain comes from manu tenere, to hold on to something with the hand, which I think is really interesting in a place where we're constantly opening the hand of thought. We need to not get confused. There are times where apparently holding on to something with the hand is important. So this thing starts out meaning to hold on to something with the hand, and eventually it comes to mean to practice something habitually. And I think that's useful for us. Maintaining something is to practice something regularly, right? So when I see maintain in this verse, I'm immediately pointed back to three kinds of three treasures, right? Abiding, manifesting, and maintaining. So how do we see, hear, accept, maintain the Dharma? So we've heard this, of course, many times before, but quick review. The absolute three treasures are Buddha as unsurpassable true awakening, Aniccarya Samyak Sambodhi. Dharma as the reality that is pure and free from defilement, the way this universe actually works. Sangha is the virtue of peace and harmony. So peace and harmony itself. Manifesting three treasures, Buddha as Gautama, right? Somebody who lived in the world, later Shakyamuni, who actually historically we accept appeared in this world as a teacher. The Dharma as the content of his awakening, what he traveled and taught to others. Sangha as the people who gathered around Shakyamuni back in the day and formed a practice community. These are things that manifested in the world. So historically we accept that these things were physically there. Maintaining three treasures. Buddha figures and images that we encounter today. I would argue anybody who embodies awakening. Somebody who's giving precepts is actually sitting in the place of Buddha. So Dharma as teachings that we still encounter in sutras, in books, in videos, on the website, coming from the mouths of speakers, right? And Sangha, here we are, modern day practice communities that are still carrying on Zazen work and study. So that's the maintaining piece, right? So we have the absolute three treasures that we can't really grasp with the intellect. We have the manifesting three treasures that we've decided to accept as historically appearing in the world. And we have the maintaining three treasures, which are what we actually encounter ourselves today, right here. And beyond this room, right? But in the here and now. So retaining and maintaining Dharma is remembering our commitment to practice, remembering our commitment to embody awakening, right here and now, moment after moment, when we're walking the dog, when we're sitting in class, when we're paying the bills, right? Moment by moment. We retain in our memory what Buddhas and ancestors and teachers have taught us and how they practiced, right? I think it's not just enough to go back and read the books. So many people, I think, read, certainly in a contemporary sense, will read a contemporary Dharma writer's writings and sort of fall in love with that person without really knowing how that person practices. How do our teachers practice? That's important. Okay, so we aspire to keep that alive in a concrete way. We encounter these things and then we think, I want to carry that. I want to move that forward in the world, right? I want to carry that into the world. So Buddha remains alive today only when we actually embody his practice, when we manifest prajna, shila, samadhi, or wisdom and ethics and concentration. So it's rare to encounter and really understand and really enter into the Dharma. So now I'm about to receive some teachings. I'm ready to see and hear them. I'm ready to take them in at all levels and integrate them and let them completely sink in so I remember how to live as a bodhisattva all the time. So I can see both form and emptiness, and then I can turn that understanding around and liberate beings. So we're clearly not saying, well, you know, thanks for the swell teachings and I'm going to gobble them up on my own and make my ego happy, right? Make myself feel better or make myself more successful. Just like when we generate merit during a service, right? We turn that around and we dedicate that merit to other beings. So we absorb Dharma teachings so we can turn them around and offer them to the world, right? So the buck cannot stop here. The point of this thing is not to just sort of take in lots of teachings to make myself okay. So when you receive Dharma transmission as a teacher in this tradition, your job then is to make sure you hand that transmission on to somebody before you die, right? So, you know, so the lineage goes on and the three treasures remain in the world. You don't just sort of take that on for yourself. The buck doesn't stop here. You're just a conduit for sort of ongoingly maintaining those three treasures. That's what we're in it for. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's words. So unfold can mean, as I say, we're physically opening a book, we're unrolling a scroll that contains Dharma teachings. It can also mean we're going to unpack and realize the Dharma. And this unpack and realize, I think, are two different things. So we can unpack the meaning of some teachings that are hard to understand because they're dense, or because the words are difficult, or maybe the words aren't in English. And this is what Todo-san does, of course, when he explains Dogen's teachings to us, right? He's really unpacking all of that so that we can sort of drill down and understand it. So we can investigate the teachings so we understand them ourselves for our own growth and our own benefit and deepening our own practice. But that's not enough. We can't stop there, right? We've got to turn that around. We have to realize these teachings, make them real in the world. This is not just me soaking it up and then, you know, going into my room and being okay. We have to take this in, turn it around, make them real. This is how we unfold these teachings. I kind of think of it as like we sort of put them into motion. If I'm unfolding something, it's like I'm putting something into motion around this network, right? May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's words is sometimes translated as the Tathagata's truth. So, you know, Buddha spent his teaching life sharing with others this truth that he awakened to when he had his experience under the Bodhi tree. So his words and teachings are an expression of the true reality of all beings. So words and truth are connected. Not only are, you know, we're not just investigating words and teachings for understanding. We're actively participating in the truth of awakening. So what's the meaning of the words? What's the meaning of the truth expressed by the words? We have to enter into that whole thing, dive into that whole thing. Accomplishment of the state of dharani is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we hear the Dharma of all the Buddhas and are able to receive and retain it. So this might sound like we take in all this Dharma and receive it and sort of keep it for ourselves, like curating a collection. Sometimes I feel this way, and maybe you do too. It's like I'm out there collecting little bits of Dharma, little bits of information. I'm sort of filing them away in my own little, my own little personal library that I can pull on and draw on. And I think that's not wrong. I mean, we do that. That's how we learn. You know, sort of like curating this museum collection or something, right? But remembering what Buddha taught and remembering to practice by their nature are not only about our own situation. If we really understand what Buddha, Dharma, Sangha are it's really not possible to do this only for the small self. It's just not the way it works, and we get to see that pretty clearly. So to receive and retain the Dharma means simply moving through the world as a bodhisattva. We receive, we retain the Dharma, we move through the world with an outward focus as well as an inward focus. So we're not cutting off one or the other. I'm not saying we don't pay attention to this, right? We move through the world pointing both ways. So I'm reminded of the number of times in the Shobogenzo's Zuimon-ki where Dogen Zenji refers to our being vessels of the Dharma. I've talked about that before, right? He says, never think that you're not a vessel of the Dharma. So I get this picture like Dharma gets poured in, right? And we accept and receive and take care of that Dharma. And just like water takes the shape of whatever container it's poured into, the Dharma manifests in each of us according to our karmic conditions. So according to the shape of our karmic conditions, Dharma manifests. So I am terrible at spatial relations. I get lost leaving my front door. That is not something I'm good at. Other people, I have a Dharma sister who's very good at it. The shape of her manifesting the Dharma is she's really good at that, right? The shape of my manifesting the Dharma is that I can make a wooden bowl. So like we've all got something to contribute, something to add. In no case are we not vessels of the Dharma. So Dogen says this over and over and over. Don't think that you are not receiving, carrying, embodying, curating, turning around the Dharma, because it's not possible for you not to do that. So to remember to practice is to retain the Dharma as this kind of vessel, to be a source of skillful action in the world, I think, that relies on or is based on our bodhicitta. So what would you all like to say or ask about the state of dharani? Remembering what Buddha taught, anything we've brought up here today, receiving, retaining, maintaining the Dharma. I'm going to start with people in the room just because it's a little easier to facilitate, and then Sawyer can manage the folks at home. Things in the room that folks would like to bring up today? Questions, reflections, responses, looks of puzzlement? Sawyer, please.
Okay. So, I guess this is related to kind of both the opening the sutra verse and as you gave us a tour of Ryaku and how that's a kind of like purification is maybe a word for like readying yourself to receive teachings, which basically translates to sort of putting aside a lot of your own stuff or self-involvement or ideas and just being kind of able to be a vessel, I guess, able to receive. And we hear that a lot from Dogen too, like in the Zuimon-ki in the mornings, he'll talk about sort of just not sort of when you hear teachings, it's not your job to sort of like say, is that true? Is that true? Is that true? While you're receiving it anyway, it's just to sort of absorb. And I want to sort of put that piece beside what I think a lot of us are drawn to Buddhism with a sense of like, these truths are not something you just receive, it's something you have to see for yourself. It's something that you have to sort of test in your own life. So that kind of balance between just receiving whatever's given and then also sort of like seeing it in your own experience. How do you see those?
Yeah, well, we also have these teachings that say there's several ways we interact with Dharma. We hear it, and we listen to it, and we consider it, and we verify it in our own experience, and right. So I think you're making an important distinction, which says, in the moment of receiving it, can we receive in an unobstructed way? So can we avoid prejudging? Can we avoid picking and choosing? in the moment that we're sort of receiving those teachings. That doesn't mean then we don't turn around and verify, right? That we don't get on the cushion or just in the activities of our own life, we don't try it out, right? So I think it can seem like those two things are mutually exclusive, but I don't think they are. And I don't think this is saying blindly trust anybody who says they're teaching you the Dharma, right? I mean, I think we have to be a little bit cautious about, are these authentic teachings or not? And that's another whole talk, right? So I'm not saying we should be doormats, but at the same time, if we're in a sangha, we're practicing with a teacher, we've built up a certain kind of trust there, or we're reading Dogen's words or something. Can we put aside the impediments and simply take that in and let it percolate? We may not understand it for years. I mean, I'm sure you've all had this experience. I certainly have. Years later, I go, oh, that's what they meant. Oh, suddenly something like click. You go, oh, that's what that teacher said, or that's what that, right? Okay, I'm just going to take it in and kind of let it do its thing. I'm just going to sit with that for a while, right? So I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and I think it's important that we make that we understand it that way. Anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, I guess it sort of came up for me because I read a little thing that was talking about sort of the idea of how to know if a teacher or teachings are authentic, and it comes from, I think, a Pali Sutta. Someone asked the Buddha, like, how do we know if a teacher is legit, kind of, and what he said was sort of pay attention to how they seem to be, whether they are free of greed, anger, and ignorance. So sort of paying attention to, does that teacher embody being, or that teaching embody sort of being free from those three
poisonous minds, which is the basis of suffering, right?
Yeah.
Right?
But then knowing that, we ourselves are often operating by those minds, those three poisonous minds, so how do we sort of judge? How
can we use it as a yardstick for somebody else?
Yeah, through
right?
our own three poisons.
Yeah, carefully, right? Because it's, it's always, it can always be fraught in this practice when we want to hold up a yardstick to something, right? And we have the very famous sutra, which most North Americans love, that says, don't believe this because I'm telling you, try it out for yourself. So we want to bend that to say, oh, that means my own experience is the only true yardstick. And then have we got a big impediment because we can't let in anybody else's teachings because I think my opinion is the only valid, Buddha says my opinion is the only one that counts. I don't think that's what Buddha is saying, right? So how can we put that over here, take in some teachings, verify them through our own practice without being judging in a way which is about the small self and the ego, right? So I think when we're saying, verify things, does this seem to be the way the world works? Are we actually freeing ourselves and others from greed, anger, and ignorance and suffering? Or are we simply setting up something that perpetuates that, right? And that whole conversation with ourselves, I think, is a lifelong piece of discernment. I don't think we're ever done, and there are some real pitfalls there. We can really tie ourselves up in knots around some of that stuff, right? So all I can say is if we're trying to interact with a source we think is true, a source we think is an authentic teaching, then can we do that putting our impediments over here and just sort of take it in? It's an important, I think that's an important intersection. Please.
So this discussion that Sawyer brought up reminded me of something in philosophy called epistemological pragmatism, which is also misunderstood, but it's the idea that ideas aren't true. Truth happens to ideas. That, basically people think of a thing, and as people and communities are interacting with this concept, it proves itself to either work or not. And an idea could be theoretically true in one context, but over time no longer be true.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if, these sort of permanence of Dharma and also how, like, you know, society's changed and all the other stuff is kind of how we should be thinking of, you know, Dharma or Dharmas as these sort of like fluctuating things we have to experience and verify and re-verify.
Well, I think we have to be careful which kind of Dharma we're talking about,
Mhm.
right? So there's Dharma that's the way the universe works, and it would be tempting to say the universe always works the same way, but we know, I mean, that changes too. You know, universes are expanding. Even the things we don't understand, things are changing. You know, and there's Dharma as teachings, and, you know, Buddha certainly did not shy away from teaching in ways that made sense to the people who were in front of him, which causes us some confusion today because he appears to say this to this group and this to this group, and they seem to cancel each other out, right? And the way in Mahayana we've come to accept that is he's teaching according to what people can take in and where they are in their practice and what they can understand and maybe what their cultural circumstances are. And so these things can look very different and yet not cancel each other out, right? So I think what you're bringing up is important about ideas, what Uchiyama Roshi calls our fabrications. And if we look at it that way, we go, well, oh, you know, this is clearly something I made up. So, you know, if something is, so if we have a word fire and we touch that word, it doesn't burn us, right? I mean, fire is an idea. There's a thing and then there's an idea about it. So we know that too is another whole investigation about the relationship of that. But certainly we have to be willing to watch our ideas change and let go of ideas that are no longer serving us well. I think we have to be careful about thinking that everything we fabricate is by its nature bad. If that was true, we wouldn't have art, right? We wouldn't have fiction. You know, I think the thing is, do we see the nature of our ideas? Do I know this thing is a fabrication? That doesn't mean it's not useful to me. I need to have a shared understanding that a red light means stop and a green light means go. But in the world of stuff, that's clearly my fabrication. There's something with a certain wavelength of light happening. I'm attaching a meaning to that says this means I stop my car. That's useful to me, but I need to know that that's my idea, right? So how can we, in our practice, continue to see we need ideas because we need those karmic circumstances in order to be bodhisattvas in the world and to liberate beings from suffering. And then we also have to know, and also I made that up, you know, there is a karmic being called Hoko, and there also isn't one. So if I'm going to spend all of my time, you know, shoring this up and defending it, is that useful? And if I don't understand this is also a collection of 5 skandhas, which is constantly changing, I have suffering. And I create suffering for other beings, right? So, you know, we need to have ideas, we need to have fabrications, we need to know that they're fabrications, and we need to sort of verify Dharma by practicing. So there's lots to chew on in that intersection, I think. Please.
Yeah, well, the menu is not the meal, but it's nice to have a menu.
Yeah.
But the idea of pragmatism in Buddhism, there's a lot of, especially with respect to pragmatism in Nagarjuna, in his idea of instrumental truth, that has some correlation with pragmatism. In fact, John Dewey even uses the word instrumental for his particular version of pragmatism. So the main thing of pragmatism is to deny that there is something called the truth, and simultaneously denying Aristotle's idea of correspondence. That truth is not a correspondence between an idea and a thing.
Yeah.
Rather, it's a formula, as it were, that if I follow it in a certain way, I get to a certain result.
And that's interesting, isn't it? To think that, you know, just the fact that our ideas match up with reality is not about truth, right? That's just my idea happens to match up. Because this is why we have suffering, right? My idea doesn't match reality. So I'm either going to choose to ignore reality, which is going to set me up for a lot of other suffering, or I'm going to have to change my idea. Or at least understand that my idea is partially true.
Well, that's another point in pragmatism, is there are truths, not the truth.
Yeah.
And so you have to adjust your ideas about the world according to how you behave, such that a truth here doesn't necessarily apply there.
Yep.
There was something else you brought up that I wanted to explore a little bit with you. You call Sanskrit a magical language?
Well, it has been called a magical
Yeah,
language.
okay, well, so you're not asserting it's a magical language, you're saying that,
I'm saying traditionally it has been thought of as a magical language.
and we're talking about how we chant things and so forth, and of course, in the Sanskrit tradition, chanting is very important. It's sort of the idea that in the beginning was the logos, just like Hebrew, they have the same idea. That it's like the language of God, and if I chant such and such and so forth. So I guess the bottom line here is, do you believe in magic?
I would like to believe in magic.
Ah,
It's part of my temperament. I have the temperament that would like to be a wizard. So I think when I was in grad school and studying medieval Asian vernacular lit, one of the things that attracted me to that was so many stories about, sort of magical monks. I don't think I am one. So I would like to think that magic worked. And in my own mind, just to have fun with it, what I tell myself is there are more things to understand than this human mind can understand. So maybe magic works and I don't have to understand it. So I don't know. So, do I literally believe in it? Probably not. I would like to believe that it worked. I do think there are some things that we do that can influence ourselves or our surroundings in sort of useful ways. We can call that magic or not. So if I'm chanting a dharani, am I actually casting a protection spell over something? Possibly not. Is it meaningful and useful in my practice? Definitely. And does it probably help me to be a better bodhisattva? I think so. So is it having some downstream effect? I'm going to say, yeah, probably. Is it magic? Well, we talk about, so we have to be careful sometimes about the language that we use in this tradition when we are sort of applying English words to things, like we want to say things are supernatural. When I was in grad school studying some of these Buddhist texts, the prof I had at the time said, we have to be careful about that. Supernatural means outside of nature. Well, in Buddhism, there is nothing outside of nature. There's unsurpassed, Dharma. So what is outside of that? So to call something supernatural, he used the word fantastic. I went, okay. Maybe that makes more sense. And it sounds like a silly thing, but when you think about it, you just think, okay, supernatural means like outside of the functioning of Jiju Yudzamai. Well, that can't be. So I don't know. I think we have lots of ways to think about that. So for fun, I would like to think it's true, because in my soul, I aspire to be a wizard. But I'm practical enough to not rely on it. I'm practical enough that I actually get up and get my food rather than sending my bowls flying across the room to be served. There's a story about that. I'm not expecting that I'm going to send my bowls to Sawyer, kind of psychically, and he's going to fill them up and send them back. So, yeah, interesting. Anything else about that?
well, I hope you're not disenchanted.
I am not disenchanted. I just think there's things we can't understand, and I feel like I can hold that sort of magical thing alongside the reality of my practice, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to choose to think there's plenty of things I can't understand, and I don't know. I'm not a magic world person, and at the same time, there have been times in my life where I've thrown myself into the house of Buddha, and somehow things have worked out. I don't know. Please.
Yeah, along the line you were talking about the meaning of maintaining, holding with the hand. And it sort of reminded me of a phrase that I remember reading at one point, like talking about two modes of practice, holding fast and letting go. How do we understand that kind of, I mean, how do we know when to hold fast and when to let go?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, the danger of holding fast is we become rigid and inflexible and impeded and, right? How do we embody and carry an authentic transmission of this tradition and not become so inflexible that we can't adapt to the bodhisattvas that are in front of us? And I think in the 21st century North America, that's a live question. Now, Toto-san has always said from the beginning, we need to be creative and flexible. We're not in Japan. It's not 800 years ago. We need to practice in a way that allows people in, allows Western people in, and at the same time, for me personally, as the person who's kind of running this joint, not losing the spirit of the practice is really important. I really don't want to find that 20 years from now we've wandered away from the spirit of the practice because this one was ignorant and didn't know, like what was the core of this thing. So for that, I want to hold fast to the spirit and the intention and the direction and the aspiration and the bodhicitta of our Buddhism ancestors and teachers. And I also have to be able to speak for myself. I also have to be able to open the hand enough to say, there are some things we can't do here. There are some things we need to modify here. This is not a group of residential practitioners who are training to be clergy. If I try to apply that model here, you will all leave me. And you should. Right? So we need to be, there needs to be holding both of those things. And I think that can be a very difficult question in sanghas. And so we see in this country sanghas that look like a lot of things, a lot of different personalities and a lot of different characters in sanghas, and it really depends on like what feels meaningful, right? But I think if we look back in our tradition, that's always been true. Different sects have formed around specific practices or specific texts or things they found meaningful, right? So how do we hold both of those? When it comes to us as individuals, I think we have the same conundrum. How do I hold fast to bodhicitta, this aspiration for awakening and for being a bodhisattva, and yet open the hand enough to say, my karmic circumstances are not like somebody else's. I mean, I have to do that as a teacher. My karmic circumstances are not the same as Todo-san's. I don't want to lose his spirit of his practice as my teacher. But I can't do what he does. I'm a different person in a different set of circumstances. So how do I take what he's transmitted to me and then, in my own practice, carry that out, but in a way that makes sense, right? It's a live question. It's a live question. I don't think we're ever done with the discernment around that. Other folks in this room? God, we've got some interesting places already today. How about folks at home? Anything from folks at home?
I would like to ask, you talked about the fire, that saying fire is not like fire. I was coached to this one. So when you say fire, you should not feel the heat because it's just a word. You're not attached to it, right? But when you see fire, you become one with the fire. So you should not be afraid of it because you are one. You feel it. You don't need to be afraid of it.
Mm.
Now let's take it to something more complicated that now is running in my mind lately. Let's say now there are many wars and little children are dying. So let's say you really see a small child that was murdered. So now, for me, I feel pain inside. Whatever is sex or gender or country, I feel pain. But do we really need to feel, if we really feel pain, do we already need to not feel pain? This is my question.
No,
if you want to be in emptiness.
Yep,
emptiness.
We can't help but feel that pain because of interconnectedness, right? One being is suffering, all beings are suffering. So of course when we see a child being harmed, of course we, as bodhisattvas, as human beings, we feel that pain because of interconnectedness. We don't need to deny that pain or pretend it doesn't exist or look away from that or something. That's very real. It's very real. Now, our challenge as bodhisattvas is, what do I do with that pain? If that war is halfway around the world, what do I do? Or if that child is harmed right in front of me, what do I do? Or if the car is coming down the street and the child is in the road in the way, what do I do? I'm not going to give you an answer to that because I can't. That's for each of us in that moment in our practice to decide. But I would certainly not deny that we feel that suffering, right? That empathy is very real. So when I'm saying things like, there's fire, but if we touch that word, it doesn't harm us, or it doesn't, I don't get burned by that word, That's a very basic teaching that helps us, I'm going to say, become disenchanted with our fabrications. That doesn't mean those fabrications aren't useful or that we don't have complex ideas about the world, because we certainly do. We need, when we see that child suffering, one of the challenges for us is we need to see that clearly. Because so often we see something which is really charged like that, and we bring a lot of our own stuff to it. It reminds me of a time when, or this is like something that happened to me, or, you know, we're going to throw a lot of stories in it, or we're going to immediately leap to who I think is perpetuating that harm and what I think about that, right? So all of that enters into that story. Can we, this is very difficult, can we see what's happening with wisdom and compassion in a very clear way? That's our practice. I know that's not a satisfactory answer to you.
No, it really is. It really is. Just like if you see somebody suffering, you really feel the suffering. So maybe just don't get into depression, but really feel, if you really feel the suffering, you don't need to get to depression, but you really need to see the suffering.
You really need to not look away. Job one of the Bodhisattva is not to look away. So when we see the amount of suffering in this world, when we see the world on fire, boy, can it be discouraging. You know, I mean, talk about just, we're paralyzed, we can't do anything because we can't do everything. And this is a conversation we have here a lot, right? This comes up a lot in Sanghas and certainly here. You know, we can't save everybody, what do? We do the small things we can actually do. And those things might appear to be unrelated to a conflict somewhere else. Simply getting on the cushion and learning how not to perpetuate suffering in my own life and in my own community and in my own neighborhood and family, believe it or not, is directly related to how do we not, you know, how do we bring compassion and wisdom into the world. It might seem like a waste of time, and I'll tell you it's not. Because of the interconnectedness, anything we put into this network of dependent origination is in the entire network. What are we putting in there? Are we putting in kindness and compassion and wisdom? Or are we putting in, you know, retribution and hatred and anger and greed? What are we putting into the world? So even the small, skillful, beneficial things we do in the world are contributing to the whole because it's all connected and it can't not be. So in that way, I think we can keep ourselves a little bit encouraged. That doesn't mean we don't feel that pain, because boy, do we. But if we feel like I can't do anything because I can't do everything, then we can't get out of bed in the morning. And then are we really following our bodhisattva vows, right? The good news is we get out of bed every morning, we have the bodhisattva vows, there's something we can do. There's some small thing somewhere we can do, and we should. Other things from folks at home?
Hoko, yeah. I just had a comment, I think it goes back or came up after Sawyer's comments about kind of recognizing a true teacher. And I appreciated your comment that in the Gates statement that the state of dharani is not really about like entering into a trance, some kind of special state. But like the themes that you drew out about that there are elements about cultivating like not a state, but an attitude of receptivity. And at least for me, I think that there are certainly times when I notice that in a chant or in a ceremony that that I feel like perhaps like that's I can notice that is that state. Am I feeling receptive? Mm-hmm. And so, in some ways, it can be a moment to check in for myself and just get a sense of where are the maybe blocks where I'm caught up in thinking. Mm-hmm. And just, noticing, am I closed off from the teaching at this moment? So, and I think that for me, certainly bringing those into daily life can be helpful if I can kind of keep cultivating that sense of receptivity and not making it kind of an empty habit.
So I think Neil's bringing up something important. I talked about something formal like a ceremony which says we do this, and do this, and do this, and kind of empty ourselves out, and now we're ready. And I think what he's bringing up is, and every single moment, if all sentient and insentient beings are preaching the Dharma, at what point are we not receiving Dharma teachings, right? So at what point do we not benefit by sort of making ourselves receptive and putting our hindrances to one side and receiving the teachings that are happening all the time. Other things from folks at home? Or anybody here?
I just have
Please.
one little bit of thing to add to this. In the Recovery Dharma community, a lot of people are really new to sitting. I mean, just days or weeks, and they're kind of excited about it, you know. So, one of the things that I try and instill and we talk about is that when you sit, when you start this practice, when you're doing zazen, you're making yourself available. And so you're emptying in that way. You're letting go of all that stuff.
Yep.
And making yourself available.
Yes. Yes. So in that moment, all of that old twisted karma doesn't have to be driving you.
Right.
And we have a lot of old twisted karma. And, you know, that's it keeps driving it. So in that moment of sitting and dropping off body and mind, right, there's nothing else happening but just this sitting. So we don't have to be driven by old history, old injuries, preconceptions, old hatreds, bad relationships, whatever's going on. Right?
And the
And
way
what a
that,
relief.
yeah, and the way that is really kind of directly connected to people that are having issues with addiction
Of course.
is that
There's real karma there.
you are not available. One
Yeah.
is not there.
Yeah.
Not
Absolutely.
there to be with anyone.
So imagine if you could put that aside and then experience the world that way,
Right.
not completely caught up in all the drivers of that. Like, whew, what a relief. What a relief.
Yeah.
Like, you're okay. You're sitting zazen, you're okay. None of that stuff has to be driving you. You can just... I've got to think there's a fair amount of defensiveness in that kind of karma. I've had to learn to protect myself. I may be doing some things that are unskillful, but I'm doing it to protect myself. So it can be really scary. You sit down in zazen and you drop off body and mind. You're available, but you're vulnerable. And you're vulnerable to your stuff. Because there's a lot of stuff you don't want to think about. It's like, I don't want that to be in my life, whatever it is, right? So I can imagine there's a certain amount of courage your group really needs to sit down and put those defenses over here and to be available, but to be available is to be vulnerable. So I give them a lot of credit. Whew. And see what happens. And my hope is in zazen, something peaceful happens. Right? That's a safe place. I'm hopeful that it's clear that that's a safe place. Right? Because that availability is sometimes scary. It means we're interacting, it means we're interconnected, and sometimes we're interconnected with things we aren't so happy about. I mean, that's true for everybody, right? The fact that we're part of this network of interdependent origination means we're not separate from the child being harmed or the things that make us uncomfortable. And so, whew, to be available to that, that is real bodhisattva activity. When I say the job one of the bodhisattva is not to look away, I mean, that is not easy stuff. And that's what your people are doing. So good on them. And I'm glad you're encouraging. I'm glad you can encourage that. Other things from anybody this morning, here or away? Have we had enough for this morning? Okay. Let's do our closing chant. We'll move on to our world peace ceremony. Thanks, everybody.